The Vietnam War is remembered by many as the most futile and heartbreaking war America ever fought.
More than 3 million had been killed as a direct result of the war, including 58,000 Americans.
The Vietnam War began when, after 10 years of fighting the French, Vietnam won its independence, only to find themselves a divided nation.
South Vietnam was against communism, while North Vietnam supported it.
By 1958, a war had begun between the two.
And by 1962, the United States had sent in 9,000 troops in an effort to aid South Vietnam and block the spread of communism.
82,000 troops had been deployed by the year 1965. 100,000 were sent the following year, and another 100,000 the year after that.
In 1969, more than 500,000 military personnel were involved with the war.
This led to a revolution of mass protesting at home in America. Hundreds of people would rally in efforts to end the war.
The largest group of protesters drew more than 250,000 people.
After almost 20 years of fighting, America agreed to withdraw in exchange for the release of U.S. prisoners of war, bowing to public pressure and a great deal of casualties.
However, 2 years later, South Vietnam fell and Vietnam reunited under a communist regime.
The after effects of the war were devastating to the soldiers in America. According to a survey by the Veterans Administration, some 500,000 of the 3 million troops who served in Vietnam suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and rates of divorce, suicide, alcoholism, and drug addiction were markedly higher among veterans.
But it was even worse in Vietnam. Because the war was fought in their country, not only were psychological events of the war detrimental, but their land was ruined as well. Society thrived on agriculture, and battles and bombs had destroyed farmland.
Crops and land were decimated when the fields in North Saigon were bombed with herbicides.
Having no other food to eat, people were forced to eat the poisoned food, and many children suffered terrible diseases.
Others suffered disabilities caused by the chemical weapons used in warfare.
And thousands were left orphaned when their parents' lives were taken. More still were left on the street when born because of rape or affairs with American men.
Re-education centers called New Economic Zones were created in an effort to help a struggling economy.
Reminiscent of the Holocaust, citizens were forced to complete harsh tasks in the camps such as minefield sweeping, tree cutting, digging, construction, and other physical labors. Additionally, thousands faced torture and abuse.
This led the North and South parts of Vietnam to truly hate each other.
For the Vietnamese, the war lasted almost 30 whole years.
Because of the considerable aftershock all those involved with the war experienced, new art was created to portray these conditions.
One major art form that reflected the experience people gained from the war was musical theater.
One example of this is the musical Dogfight, which is based off the film of the same name. In Dogfight, a group of young men are celebrating their last few days in America before shipping off to become U.S. Marines in the war. The audience witnesses all their anticipation and excitement as they fantasize about the parades, celebrations, and respect they'll receive upon returning from the fight. Here's a short section of the song Ticker Tape Parade.
To hold the gun, serve your year and then you're done. Homeward bound, the boy gets crowned as he wins his favorite son. At the hometown heroes, ticker tape parade, cotton candy and lemonade. It's a hometown heroes ticker tape parade. Can't get that from any arcade. Your name is well, the flames unveiled, your face on a big balloon.
Unfortunately, most of them don't return. The one soldier that does is spat on and ridiculed. Here's a section of the song Come Back, which he sings after being mocked for surviving.
Excuse me. Help me out.
This song is an accurate portrayal of how many soldiers were treated upon returning from the war. Most of them were still dealing with post-traumatic stress. The people whose loved ones had died and who strongly opposed the war took their anger out on the soldiers who survived. Some believed them to be cowards who only survived because they ran or hid, and were not shy about expressing their opinions towards these wounded soldiers.
So even when these brave men escaped the fight, they could not escape the war. Dogfight is an excellent example of this.
Another example of art that stemmed from the Vietnam War is the musical Hair. This musical is about a young man named Claude who is traveling to New York City for the first time to enlist in the war. He meets a group of hippies who are naturally against the idea of war and are protesting. They are led by a man named George Berger. Claude and George meet a middle-class debutante named Sheila. When she and Claude fall for each other, Berger and the others try to help make sure that they can stay together. In the end, Claude has to enlist anyways. He ends up dying in the war, and the show ends with the audience seeing how his death devastated his friends.
In this musical, we see the opposition to the drafts and the loss many families experienced due to the war. It's interesting because it shows what life was like for those not directly involved with the war.
Even though it is a fictional piece, it really is able to capture a taste of what people went through during this time, and the loss that thousands of people endured. It still doesn't compare to the real events, but it gives a good idea.
A third example is Miss Saigon. This show creates a strong contrast to the other two we have mentioned because it takes place entirely in Vietnam during the war. A 17-year-old Vietnamese girl named Kim is beginning her job as a bar girl in a brothel in Saigon. She sleeps with and falls in love with a U.S. sergeant named Chris. He takes time off and marries her shortly afterward, angering the cousin whom she had been betrothed to at age 13. Chris promises to return for her and leaves for America during the fall of Saigon. 3 years later, Chris is married to another woman in the U.S., and Kim is living in the slums with their child, Tom. After hearing from an agency, Chris and his wife return to Vietnam so he can meet his son. Kim, who still believed he would return for her, is heartbroken, but begs only that her son be taken with them back to America so he can have a good life. Chris's wife insists that Tom needs his real mother, and so Kim shoots herself so they will be forced to take him with them.
While this sounds horrifying on every level to us, it was not unheard of. Girls that needed to earn money were either lucky enough to find a job as a housekeeper or nanny, or they were forced to sell their bodies. Consequently, thousands upon thousands of half-American, half-Vietnamese children were born and abandoned in Vietnam. Much of this was due to the mothers' inabilities to support them and a deep sense of shame that many felt for consorting with the enemy.
They were called Beaudet, which is Vietnamese for the dust of the earth.
All of these musicals provide insight into a tragic time that today we have a hard time comprehending. The art that was created allows the memories to live on.
Another art form that took on the role of expressing the effects of the war was music in general.
There were many songs about how unfair people thought the drafts were. Examples of these are songs such as Draft Dodger Rag and Draft Morning.
Other songs pointed out how the wealthy were able to pay their way out of getting drafted. An example of this is Fortunate Son.
Music was how many people expressed their feelings and opinions on the war, and to reach out to others who thought similarly. It was how they grieved, and in doing so connected with people.
By using music to express themselves, people felt as though they were being heard and people would really listen.
Another way people connected was visual art.
At the start of the war, art was used as propaganda to try to persuade people to enlist in the armed forces and to donate money.
While it was used in Vietnam as propaganda, it was used in the United States for protesting the war.
There are paintings we still see on display today that were created during the war, such as the serial Bao An Vietnam.
And finally, perhaps the most personal form of art affected by this war, the literary arts.
Vietnamese and Americans alike were able to write about their own experiences.
A great example of this is the biography When Heaven and Earth Changed Places by Lili Hayslip, a Vietnamese woman who grew up during the war.
Miss Hayslip tells a shocking and heartbreaking story that is so far removed from what we know that it seems as if it takes place in another world.
She faced bombs, soldiers from both sides' attacks, intense torture, rape, and endless hardships that we can scarcely imagine.
But all of her stories reinforce how important it is for us to express our feelings through art.
The most tragic war of our time, the Vietnam War, inspired thousands of people to create art to express their feelings about it.
And because of that, today we can come a little bit closer to understanding our past.